Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Dr. Paul is traveling today, so I will do my best to helm this ship. But thankfully, I'm not alone. I've got an expert to join me today for our program. Our program today is actually about the Section 702 FISA Court Amendments. That may sound like a mouthful, but it's actually something that's very important and very simple to understand. To help us understand it, I've got Patrick Eddington joining us. Patrick is a policy analyst and expert in Homeland Security and Civil Liberties at the CATO Institute. Before that, he spent 10 years working on Capitol Hill for Representative Rush Holt, who was one of the better champions of civil liberties on the Hill, I have to say. He teaches at Georgetown in national security, and he was a military imagery analyst for the CIA from '88 to '96. So, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Daniel. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you. Now, here's the problem, of course, is that 702 is set to sunset at the end of the year. And if Congress does nothing to reauthorize, it will die. But they have done something. They've introduced the USA LIBERTY Act, which I don't know why they keep doing this, Patrick. Maybe you have an idea, but the Patriot Act was unpatriotic. They fixed it with the Freedom Act, which restricted our freedom, and now they're adding the Liberty Act, which the premise is that somehow liberty means giving up your right to privacy. I think Orwell is probably smiling or crying. But Patrick, if you can give us a little bit of a background on 702, what is it, what's it about, what's the history of it, and where are we now?
Sure. It's really pretty straightforward. The whole mass spying effort started literally the day after 9/11, when then Director of NSA Michael Hayden began this program that we ultimately came to know as Stellar Wind. That was outed by the New York Times in December of 2005. And in that period between 2005 and 2008, the Congress wrestled with essentially how to take that program, which was completely illegal, completely violative of the Fourth Amendment, and somehow make it legal. So they, of course, went through a series of legislative contortions that gave us this thing called the Protect America Act, which simply took the illegal Stellar Wind program and gave it a legal blessing, if you will. Fortunately, that had an expiration date of about 6 months, and by early 2008, opponents of that legislation, including Dr. Paul and my former boss, Rush Holt in New Jersey, had managed to kill it. I mean, we actually had a victory there. And then we were sabotaged, not just by folks in the Republican leadership, but the ultimate villain in this drama, from my perspective, is then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She essentially cut a deal with the Blue Dog Democrats, led by Steny Hoyer of Maryland, to pass this monstrosity called the FISA Amendments Act in order to give them some political cover so they wouldn't be attacked for being, quote, soft on terror going into the 2008 election cycle. And the problem ultimately was this legislation left intact and made semi-permanent, essentially, this mass surveillance regime. Now, proponents of it said, look, what we're going to do specifically through this Section 702 is allow the government to go and get the communications of foreign nationals who are potentially a threat to the United States. That sounds fine on the surface, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is, in doing so, they wind up sweeping up the communications of a huge number of Americans. In my judgment, it's been at least in the hundreds of thousands on a yearly basis. It may well be even higher than that. The Director of National Intelligence has refused to make that number public. And one of the problems with this legislation that's been proposed now by Mr. Goodlatte of Virginia, Mr. Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, Mr. Conyers of Michigan, and Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, is that it would give the DNI an out to basically not produce that number. But that's not the biggest problem with this bill. The biggest problem with this bill is it allows the government to continue to maintain my data, your data, anybody's data who has contacted by phone or through the email or text message folks overseas, essentially for at least 90 days. And there's a waiver requirement that would allow them, to keep it on an individualized basis for basically an indefinite period of time. So as I like to say, oftentimes in Washington, this is a perfect example of let's not but say we did. They're trying to say that they're reforming these surveillance authorities, but at the end of the day, this bill is a sham.
So the idea that 702 will expire at the end of the year, 702 enables them to mass collect our communications if we happen to be communicating with someone overseas. What would happen if nothing happened? What would happen if they didn't do anything? You know, the claim is, of course, it would be the end of the world. Terrorism would run rampant through the United States, and we'd be reduced to, you know, primitive existence.
Well, it's important to remember that these mass surveillance programs, whether we talk Stellar Wind or the Section 215 Patriot Act program, commonly referred to as either the business record section or the library provision, both of those programs were complete failures. They never stopped an attack on this country. They were constitutionally violative, and they wasted literally millions and millions of taxpayer dollars. And in my judgment, this program, the 702 program, has been no different. And I think it was very revealing, Daniel, that at the end of September, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Director of NSA, and folks over at the Department of Justice, they put on this big push with the press here in Washington. They brought them to a special pen and pad, a kind of a semi-off-the-record thing, where they allegedly revealed some additional examples of 702 supposedly being this big success. And they did not produce a single example of 702 stopping a terrorist attack on this country. Not a single one. So the idea that if this program goes away, we're somehow going to be laid waste by ISIS wannabes is just another example of the kind of post-9/11 fear-mongering that we really need to get past.
Yeah, it does seem that we've become the targets. We certainly learned a lot from Snowden in that front. But you know, you have a piece that you put up at CATO, and we, thankfully, because you have Creative Commons, we put it up on the Ron Paul Institute side as well. And I think you did a really good, quick and dirty take on the first sight of the new bill, the USA LIBERTY Act. And you had three main early objections. Hats off to you for being able to read that. I looked through it again this morning, and it reminded me of the worst parts of Capitol Hill, you know. Strike comma in line 48 and add, you know. But your three objections, I think, and you went over one of them, but let's just go over them one by one just quickly.
Sure.
First is the mandatory data destruction is not mandatory.
Yeah.
It almost sounds to me like it's a pre-crime in a way that they can collect and keep all this data in case at some time in the future you become an enemy of the state. Like it's a pre-crime in a way that they can collect and keep all this data in case at some time in the future you become an enemy of the state or something. Tell us why you think this is a problem.
Well, you know, the fundamental problem.
Tell us why you think this is a problem.
Well, you know, the fundamental problem here is that they shouldn't be collecting and storing and searching through the communications of innocent Americans. You know, I think all of them here is that they shouldn't be collecting and storing and searching through the communications of innocent Americans. You know, I think all of us want them to actually be able to identify real bad actors and prevent them from doing harm here in the United States.
Absolutely.
I think we're all in the same, you know, I think all of us want them to actually be able to identify real bad actors and prevent them from doing harm here in the United States.
Absolutely.
I think we're all on the same, you know, I think page about that.
Oh, yeah.
The problem is when you allow the government to sweep up this amount of data, and it's done at this point in a relatively indiscriminate way, what they kind of argue is, well, you know, somebody might wind up being a problem later on down the road, and we might find some things, you know, in the future. And so this is the kind of, you use the pre-crime analogy, and I think it's a really good one. It's a presumption that people are guilty until proven innocent, which, as you know, is a very Soviet way of kind of looking at things. So they have no business keeping my data, your data, anybody's data, who is not the actual subject of an authorized criminal investigation. They simply don't. And this legislation would allow them to continue to do that minimally for 90 days. And if they get a waiver from the DNI, and I don't care how specific they have to be, it's still just a paperwork exercise, right?
Yeah.
So there's no provision in here that says Congress can, in 15 days, you know, agree that you know, we're not going to allow you to do this. You know, there are no caveats like that in this legislation. So it really is just a paper exercise as far as I'm concerned.
Now, Patrick, you used a word I think that's so apropos. You talked about the Soviet system. And of course, we know a lot about the gulags and the tortures and the horrors of totalitarian systems in general. But I think in some ways a more insidious aspect of totalitarian regimes is when they cause you to self-censor, when they cause you to change the way you live, completely
Exactly.
almost rewire the DNA of your brain to react to this oppression. It's in some ways worse than a boot in the neck. And I think you've captured it there with that statement. It changes the way we think about our relationship to the government, of course.
Yes.
But you talk about oversight. You talk about the waivers that they can get to keep it longer than the 90 days. My question was, well, what kind of oversight would there be if the director of the NSA said, okay, I need a waiver for all these guys, these whatever. Is there any watchdog? Is there any one that can say, well, hold on a minute? That seems to be a real loophole.
Well, there is a fundamental problem with all of this kind of legislation, and that is, in the end, there's no truly independent audit mechanism built into this equation. And when I say independent, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about the NSA Inspector General. I don't consider that to be an independent audit. I don't even consider the Inspector General of the intelligence community to be a truly independent audit. When the framers created the Constitution, Article 1 was the Congress for a reason. They wanted the Congress to basically be the one essentially running the show, if you will. And when Congress chooses to outsource its oversight responsibilities, which it most definitely would be doing with this legislation on this particular issue, that's completely unacceptable. The Government Accountability Office should be the entity involved in these kinds of audits, and they should, in my judgment, be at least semi-annual. So that, to me, is like a huge, huge problem with this legislation.
Yeah. Let's quickly run through your other two objections. First is lying to FISA Court. You talked about the duplicity involved in going to the FISA Court. Explain to us your objections in this count.
So my friend Marcy Wheeler, who is an independent journalist and blogger, worked on a document for Demand Progress, which they published at the end of September, which goes into excruciating detail, although just in about a 12-page report, about the number of times that executive branch officials have been caught lying to the FISA court, caught essentially engaged in direct Fourth Amendment violations, a whole series of evasions. I recommend that folks take a look at that report. I raise it because there's not one word in this bill that even talks about those violations, much less any kind of remedy to shut these things down. And a lot of folks, you'll hear them say, well, why don't they refer to the Justice Department and so on and so forth. I'm very old-fashioned about these things, Daniel. I believe the impeachment mechanism was included, in the Constitution to be used for exactly these kinds of circumstances. If folks are going to come from DOJ and NSA and lie to the FISA court, and then the court is not going to impose criminal sanctions, which they should in each and every one of these cases where these folks have been caught lying, then it seems to me that it's Congress's responsibility to identify the guilty executive branch officials and impeach them and remove them from office. And that is nowhere to be found. No kind of policing mechanism is to be found in this legislation.
Otherwise, we're just a banana republic, if they can do this. Now, the last one is a good one, too, because you mentioned Senator Wyden's heroic efforts to try to figure out how many Americans were caught up into this dragnet. And so you call this hiding the real numbers. We have no idea how big the program is, right?
Well, we have no idea, number one, how big the program is. We also have no idea about the totality of the communications that have been captured. My own ballpark estimate is that it's in the millions.
Wow.
Over the course of the life of this program. And the idea that they're allowed to suck this data up and put it on government servers and then go through and search it anytime they bloody well want to, which is pretty much what they're able to do now, is completely unacceptable. It's also unacceptable because, as we all know, we live in the age of cyber attacks, right? Mm-hmm. So all of our personal data is vulnerable sitting on IRS servers. It's vulnerable sitting on NSA servers. And they've proven they can't protect this data, right? They've had a huge number of breaches, DOE breaches, the OPM breaches. A lot of these tools that my former employer, the CIA, was using, have been leaked. So the idea that they are in any kind of position to safeguard data that they shouldn't have in the first place is laughable. It's just simply laughable. So Senator Wyden is to be commended, for trying to stay after this. But it's going to take a legislative baseball bat in order to get these folks to actually come clean. And give us a number. And of course, you and I know why they don't want that number out there.
Oh, yeah.
Because if the real number was out there, people would freak out. Mm-hmm. They would, it would be a public relations disaster for them. And it would only help to underscore the point that people like you and me and Dr. Paul and others, make all the the time that this is beyond out of control. This needs to be reined in, and folks at NSA and DOJ, they know that, and that's why they want to continue to hide the ball, so to speak.
No, that's a great point. People would say, hey, hold on, I thought this was all about the terrorism. Why are you monitoring my Aunt Minnie or something, you know? But, you know, Patrick, you've got a great quote in this, and I'm going to basically almost end with this. I'm going to have one other point after this, but I want to read the quote because it's really very, very important. It should sink in. You said, it's important to remember that the underlying premise of the FISA Amendments Act and Patriot Act, that 9/11 happened because government didn't collect enough info on terrorists prior to the attacks, has been refuted by Congressional Joint Inquiry and the 9/11 Commission. So the whole underlying principle behind these is faulty.
It is. It's been a lie from the very beginning. And it's amazing how successful folks in the executive branch and these national security entities have been at basically maintaining that lie. And unfortunately, as you and I both well know, they've had entirely too many de facto co-conspirators in multiple Congresses since 9/11. You know, I mean, Dr. Paul and Mr. Holt were oftentimes, you know, two voices seemingly in the wilderness, basically warning people, look, this is just a repeat of what we see in the past. But in the digital age, it becomes so much more problematic because when the government has the ability to collect this data, when they can use devices like stingrays, which are cell site simulators, when they can do all these other things to essentially track where you and I are at, they actually have the capacity to create a de facto digital gulag. Okay, they almost don't need to put you inside of a fence-secured compound to keep track of you with, you know, because they have all this technology and access to all this data. And that is truly dystopian, and it is completely antithetical to what the founders would have wanted. I'm confident that if the man who put their name on the Declaration of Independence were alive today and they saw this going on, they would already have organized a resistance to this. I mean, and we'd probably be in a very different place, quite frankly. But there's so much that's happened to our country, as you and Dr. Paul and others have talked about over the course, you know, the last, probably 100 years, where we simply, as a nation, have ceased to value freedom in so many ways. We've ceased to value liberty. And people continue to engage in this false dichotomy that, well, somehow there's this balancing act between security and liberty. But as you and I and Dr. Paul know, the founders understood that if you could not be safe from your own government, you could never be free, right? And that's exactly where we are today. And that's why this is such a critical inflection point in our history, and why, you know, ensuring that something like this is not allowed to continue is so incredibly important for anybody who cares about American liberty.
Well, Patrick, a lot of people are going to listen to your last very eloquent couple of points, and they're going to be angry, and they're going to say, what the heck can we do? We're furious about this. We want to do something. You and I both spent a lot of time on the Hill. A lot of people say, hey, what's the point? It's not going to make any difference if I call my rep. My experience has been different. I don't know how it was in Mr. Holt's office. It may not have changed Dr. Paul's votes on issues that he was philosophically opposed to, but we certainly took notice. What would you recommend that people do who've listened to what you've said, they're as frustrated as we both are about this, and they want to do something?
Well, I will say that, you know, from a CATO perspective, we can't take pro or con positions on legislation because of our IRS status. But I will say,
us too, yeah, of course.
Yeah, but I will say that, you know, as a former Hill staffer, I cannot emphasize enough just exactly how much of an effect it really can have to sit down directly with your member of Congress and make it explicitly clear to them that this is completely unacceptable to you. And frankly, you know, the larger the numbers that you ultimately come in with, the better off you are. And a lot of people, I know it's like, why should I bother to go to a town hall? I'll tell you something. If you take 10 or 15 like-minded people to a town hall, and you've got signs and placards and things of that nature, you're absolutely going to get press coverage. You're going to get their attention, and you're going to be able to put some pressure on them. And at the end of the day, that's what people need to know, because not enough folks at the end of the day are really speaking up about this and making enough of a fuss about this. And a lot of the politicians here in Washington, as you know, unless the phones are lighting up, unless the email box is clogged and all the rest of that, you know, they're going to go off and they're going to listen to DOJ and NSA, and it's like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. And of course, it's horrible, you know. So the more folks speak up, the more they're going to know that there may well be a political consequence down the road if they vote against liberty.
Absolutely. And a lot of it's just educating your member. It does not necessarily say vote against this or vote against that or vote for this. It's educating them on the issues.
Yeah.
And you've done a great job in your short piece and in the work that you do at CATO. You've done a great job to do that. And we're very happy that you're there doing good work. And I really want to thank you for joining us today and really making clear why we should pay attention to this legislation.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. And I also want to thank our audience for tuning into the Liberty Report today. Please come back soon.